This work is a parody of Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast. Mr. Carlin is not associated with this production, and any views or opinions presented in this podcast are solely those of Alex Berg and Jason Green.
What you're about to hear is episode 4 of a multi-part series on the War of the Five Kings. And now, to be perfectly honest, this is a point where a lot of people enter the story, so it's not the worst thing in the world if you just started here. But if you really want to appreciate what's going on in Westeros, I recommend you go back and check out the first 3 episodes. Either way, here is Shadow of the Dragon, Part 4.
So long as I am your king,
It's history.
treason shall never go unpunished.
The events.
There's a brave men knocking at our door.
The drama.
Let's go kill them.
The figures.
When you play the Game of Thrones, you win. Or you die.
It's hardcore Game of Thrones.
Winter is coming.
What do you think you'd have to do to get the nickname the Dragonbane? I mean, it's pretty impressive sounding, isn't it? The Dragonbane. I mean, it makes me think of some legendary knight hunting down dragons, dodging giant columns of fire, and almost getting shredded to bits by teeth the size of Volkswagens. Or maybe even a wizard wandering through the wilderness, saving his homeland from the scourge of dragons with really cool spells like, I don't know, lightning bolts from his or her staff, or maybe even shooting giant deadly fireballs at it, which would be a nice, ironic death for a dragon. In the world of Westeros, though, the man who earned the name the Dragonbane wasn't a knight, and he wasn't a wizard either. He was he was a king. But he was also a recluse who didn't like people and didn't like fighting, didn't like dragons, and seemed to be, by and large, just kind of a dud. His name was Aegon Targaryen III, also known as Aegon the Unlucky, also known as Aegon the Dragonbane. And he got that name not from combat or magic, but from indifference, maybe, or perhaps apathy would be a better word for it. You know, when Aegon the Conqueror started earning his nickname, his family, the Targaryens, had 3 dragons, which is how they conquered Westeros, and over the years that number kept going up. Because whenever a new Targaryen was born, they were given a dragon's egg. Literally. I mean, it was placed in the cradle with them. The hope being that someday after it hatched, the Targaryen lordling would bond, and then boom, the kid had like a deadly Calvin and Hobbes type situation, and the Targaryens added another dragon to their army. It was a pretty sweet deal for everyone. Well, all the Targaryens, at least. So by the time Aegon III was 9 years old, which would be, roughly 129 AC, the Targaryens had somewhere in the neighborhood of 21 dragons at their disposal, which was pretty great for them because, well, aside from just being generally sort of awesome, having 21 dragons gives you almost unlimited military power, which in Westeros translates directly to political power. Because the entire realm knows that only 129 years earlier, a guy with just 3 dragons was able to conquer the entire continent, basically. So just think of what they could do with 7 times that number. Now, ever since the doom of Valyria, the Targaryens had the dragon-owning market cornered. Those 20-some-odd dragons they had weren't just the only dragons in Westeros, they were the only dragons anywhere. Because, for reasons people still don't really understand, once Valyria got, just completely destroyed by tsunamis and volcanoes and all sorts of doom-related nastiness, dragons wouldn't hatch for anyone but the Targaryens. Which, to me, seems like a lot of responsibility. Not only because, dragons are the ultimate form of biological warfare, but also, you're in charge of an endangered species. I mean, very endangered. If yours die out, they're all gone. Forever. It's as if somebody put your family in charge of the last few remaining panda bears, only the panda bears are able to breathe mustard gas and turn bamboo into nuclear bombs. That's kind of the position the Targaryens are in with their dragons. I lived on the beach my senior year of college. It was a terrible house with a gorgeous view and just the Pacific Ocean stretching out in every direction. And the day I moved in, I took a long look at that view and thought to myself, boy, this is just incredible. Don't ever take this for granted. But then a year went by, I graduated, and eventually the time came to move away. And as I was walking past that view for the last time, I didn't stop to appreciate it or anything like that. Instead, I thought something along the lines of, big deal. I mean, I had gotten so used to having this incredible thing around that despite knowing better, I had let myself start taking it for granted. And now, I would do anything to have that view again. I bring that up because by the time Aegon III is born, the Targaryens are sort of treating their dragons in a big deal kind of way. I mean, maybe not that bad, but they're certainly not being treated like the extraordinarily rare, extremely valuable resource that they were. They were being taken for granted. Now, by and large, the Targaryen rule was, well, if not peaceful, it was at the very least diet peaceful, shall we say? Since the conquest, the number of wars on Westeros had gone way, way down. They were rare, but they did happen, and one of the major ones takes place between Aegon III's mother, Rhaenyra, and his cousin, who, confusingly, was also named Aegon. It's a war known as the Dance of Dragons, and it was, essentially, a family argument that played out across an entire kingdom. You know how when you're a kid, and you're headed to the car, if somebody calls shotgun, they get to sit in the front seat? But if you and your brother yelled at the same time, you might have to scrap a little bit and whoever wins gets it. Well, that's sort of what the dance is about, only the seat that's being fought over happens to be the Iron Throne. One Targaryen basically said, I called shotgun first, and another said, Dad said I could have it, and pretty soon the realm was tearing itself apart. And during this war, the Targaryens just burned through their dragons like crazy. I mean, to my eye, and admittedly I don't know much about draconic warfare, but it certainly seems like they should have been strategically deploying them after a whole heck of a lot of careful planning and consideration. But instead they acted like there's this video that made the rounds a few years back of a bunch of guys playing World of Warcraft, and they're planning this complicated attack and calculating their chances of survival, and then a guy named Leroy Jenkins just screams his name and charges in and bungles the whole thing up. That's how the Targaryens are deploying their dragons, just rushing headlong into any old battle that they see. Which, it's great to read about, two giant fire-breathing lizards wrestling across the sky while the riders on their backs have a sword fight to the death. I mean, that's just incredible. But it's also costly. When the war started, the Targaryens had 21 dragons, and by the time it's over and Aegon III is crowned king, they have 4. The singers can call it a dance, but to me it was more of a waste. Then again, nobody wants to sing a song called The Waste of Dragons, do they? And unfortunately for those remaining 4, Aegon III hates dragons. I mean, for a good reason, though. When he was 9 or 10, his mother was eaten alive by one right in front of him, so, it's totally understandable that he wouldn't be their biggest fan. I mean, I got bit by a dog one time, and they still set me a little on edge. Anyway, by the time Aegon passes away at age 36, so about 25 years after he's made king, the 4 remaining dragons are dead. Now, some became wild after they lost their riders in the war, and they flew off and were never seen again, and then some died from unknown causes. Now, the crown still has some dragon eggs laying around, though, and to his credit, before he died, Aegon III tried, admittedly half-heartedly, but he tried to get them to hatch. He brought some mages over from Essos to work a few spells on them, things like that, but after the dance, something had changed in the world. And now, for whatever reason, just like everywhere else, none of the Targaryen dragon eggs will hatch. Which means that all of a sudden, there are no more dragons left anywhere. For generations, the Targaryens will try, sometimes with fatal consequences, to bring them back to life. All the way up to Mad King Aerys, who, you may remember, thought that blowing up King's Landing with wildfire would somehow transmogrify him into an actual dragon. You always want what you can't have, and that goes double for dragons. Now, after the last of the Targaryen dragons dies, something incredible happens, and that is, nothing happens. The Targaryens stay in power. Aegon III's son becomes king, and the country just keeps humming right along. Which, on the surface, might not seem particularly impressive. I mean, it's sort of boring, right? Nothing happens, that's a little mundane. But that's exactly what I find so incredible. Because consider this. The only reason that Westeros exists in the first place is because Aegon the Conqueror had dragons. That's it. They were the only thing that got all the great lords on the same surrendering page and allowed the country to be born. Period. And it wasn't that long ago. It was, 154 years earlier? I mean, that's nothing. Historically speaking, it's the blink of an eye. The United States of America had a civil war when it was less than 100 years old, and that was a country that had come together willingly, based on a shared dream of a representative democracy. I mean, it's not like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson flew around the 13 colonies on dragonback, demanding that everybody either told the British to get lost or they'd be burned alive. No, the birth of the United States was a lot more voluntary than that, and it still almost fell apart less than 100 years later. But Westeros? There's a reason the words of House Targaryen are fire and blood. Westeros had to be forced together. The concept of having one country was still a radically new idea for the Seven Kingdoms. I mean, heck, at this point it's only 6. Dorne won't swear fealty to the Iron Throne for another 15 years after this point. Once Aegon III added Dragonbane to the end of his name, those 6 kingdoms had every reason in the world to just fall off the one government bandwagon. Especially since the great families, most of them were just kings themselves. I mean, wouldn't it be completely understandable for them to say, well, this was a lot of fun, guys, but since the dragons are all dead, we're going back to being independent rulers with absolute power now. Thanks for everything. Goodbye. But they didn't. None of them did. And as far as I can tell, nobody even really brought it up as a possibility. And I find that fascinating. Because if ever there was a time for Westeros to break apart and go back to the way things just were, it was then. And yet, it didn't happen. So my question is this. If the dragons were what brought and kept the country together, and then suddenly the dragons were all gone, well, what took their place? What's doing their job now? Who's the new hire? Well, I think it's a couple of things. The first, and I know I've brought this up before, but I think the first and major reason is peace. I mean, the default setting in the world of Westeros is suffering. Pain, hardship, despair, that stuff's all the norm. And if you can change that for people on a large scale, well, then that gives you a kind of power, doesn't it? The Targaryens proved over 150 some odd years that their way of doing things, by and large, brought peace to the realm. And so the people, their subjects, wanted to keep that going. It was sort of a, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality on a countrywide scale. And I also think it was the fact that, well, by the time the dragons died, the Targaryens had become a little bit like money. You know, on its own, money is worthless. It's just paper, or ones and zeros in a computer, or seashells, or shiny metal, or whatever people agree counts as money for that time and age. But as a species, we've infused it with meaning. We've given it value. And we've done it for so long that now, well, as long as society keeps going, money keeps its power. Similar situation with the Targaryens. The country of Westeros decided that they were the monarchs, they were the ones holding everything together, and so even though they didn't have dragons and were still new to the area and didn't even really have an army of their own, they were the ones allowed to keep running the country because the people believed that they should be. So once the dragons were gone, it almost didn't matter. The hard part, the conquering the continent part, that was pretty much already done. It was like jump-starting a car. You get the engine running and you're good to go. You don't need the cables anymore. Westeros could survive without them. And for the better part of 300 years, that's how things went. Until Mad King Aerys lost his mind and got everybody thinking about whether or not simply being born a Targaryen was enough to warrant the Iron Throne. A bunch of people decided that it wasn't, and that's how we ended up with Robert's Rebellion. Or the War of the Usurper, if you were someone who thought that the Targaryen dynasty was worth keeping around, despite Aerys's erratic behavior. In the last episode, I referred to Westeros as a machine that the Targaryens and their dragons built. And you know, since that machine kept working after the death of the dragons, a lot of people seem to have assumed that it could also survive without the Targaryens. And for the first 7 years after Robert's Rebellion, they seemed to be right. Robert Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne. His wife, Cersei Lannister, gave him a male heir named Joffrey. The great houses didn't have any major complaints, but at least not publicly, and the realm was at peace. So far, so good, right? And then, in the year 289 AC, the first cracks in that peace appear. The Iron Islands are located off the west coast of Westeros. They're near the center of the country, where the southern half of the continent is joined to the northern half by a thin little strip of land called the Neck. And they've always been a bit of a problem for, well, basically anyone who wasn't from the Iron Islands. Which is understandable, really. I mean, life on the islands is hard. These aren't tropical paradises like Hawaii or the Summer Isles or anything like that. They're much more akin to something like the Hebrides in Scotland. They're these craggy knuckles of rock jutting out from a cruel sea that routinely batters them with storms. It's an absolutely brutal landscape, and that's reflected in the culture. So much so that the people who live there call themselves the Ironborn. Everything on the Iron Islands is cold and wet and gray. It's difficult to grow any crops. There are no forests left. Education is seen as a weakness. Maesters are viewed as sorcerers, and everyone worships a deity known as the Drowned God, who really just seems to hate everyone who worships him. You know, it makes them eat seaweed, drink salt water, and generally just seems to enjoy making life miserable. And if you try to talk to the Ironborn about the old gods, or the Seven, they'll usually say something like, well, sorry, weirwoods don't grow here and we hate the Seven, so we're going to pass. And then they'll drown you for bothering them with your blasphemy. Like I said, it's a brutal place to live. They do, however, thrive at sea, out on the open water. I mean, they're phenomenal sailors, just phenomenal. Now, unfortunately, when you take that skill and couple it with the fact that they don't really have anything of value on the Iron Islands themselves, it means that for thousands of years, the Ironborn's main export was a form of piracy known as reaving. They would attack ships and towns all along the coasts of Westeros. They'd steal or destroy anything they could get their hands on, including people. They'd kill the men or send them back to the islands for a lifetime of hard, forced labor, and they'd kidnap the women, call them salt wives, and force them to have their children. And this went on for centuries. The power of the islands would ebb and flow, but their high times were pretty bad for the rest of Westeros. Harrenhal, for example, was built during one of those highs, after 3 generations of Ironborn kings had pillaged their way across the mainland and basically forced all of the Riverlands to work on an architectural passion project. All of which is just a long way of saying that for a long, long time, the Ironborn were basically terrible neighbors. Aegon the Conqueror put a stop to all of that. So by the time of Robert's Rebellion, not only was there no more reaving, there was also no more independent country. Instead, the Iron Islands are ruled by one of the great houses of Westeros, the Greyjoys, and the local economy is supported by some mining, a little farming, a little trading, and then basically by the local fishing industry. Now, their previous culture of reaving, around the islands, that's known as the Old Way. And there are entire generations of Ironborn who've been raised on stories about how great it was and how powerful their people used to be. And, you know, more than a few of them would like to hit a hard reset on the last 300 some odd years and get the old way back. It's kind of like when you drive through the southern United States, and once in a while, well, more than once in a while, sadly, but once in a while, you'll see a general store or a house or a pickup truck flying the Confederate flag, or you'll hear some old-timer refer to the War of Northern Aggression. When Robert Baratheon is sworn in as king, the leader of the Iron Islands is a guy named Balon Greyjoy, and Balon is one of those, he's a cultural fundamentalist, and he's all for bringing the old way back. All the mainland rules and customs, not to mention the taxes that have been imposed on him and his people by the throne, well, as far as he's concerned, they're invalid. Plus, on top of all that, I'm sure there were some private, personal interests at play as well. I mean, after all, Lord Balon Greyjoy doesn't sound quite as good as King Balon Greyjoy. So, after Robert's Rebellion, Balon looks at the state of Westeros. He doesn't see any dragons, he doesn't see any Targaryens, and he starts to think that, well, sure, the great houses might call Robert king when times are good, but when push comes to shove, when money and lives and time are on the line, well, maybe they won't be so quick to do what he says then. And so, 6 years after Robert's coronation, Balon sends out a message saying that the Iron Islands have seceded from Westeros. And to underline this announcement, he launches a surprise attack against Lannisport and gives the Lannister Navy a one-way trip to the bottom of the Sunset Sea. As far as rebellions go, Balon's is short-lived. His idea that Robert might not have that much support from the rest of the realm turns out to be dead wrong. Robert calls his banners, and everyone reports for duty. Now, Robert has two younger brothers, Stannis and Renly. Renly we haven't talked about much yet because, well, at this point he's still just a child. But Stannis, you might remember, is the same brother that Robert left in charge of Storm's End when Mace Tyrell, in a just extraordinarily foolish move, but when Mace Tyrell decided to lay siege to Storm's End during the rebellion. And Stannis is the same brother that Robert places in charge of the Royal Navy during Greyjoy's rebellion. Now, Stannis' accomplishments get brushed over quite a bit. He's not as flashy as his older, or for that matter, he's not as flashy as his younger brother either. But when it comes to being a battle commander, he really is just a supremely talented guy. For instance, after his appointment, he sails the Royal Navy down around the tip of Dorne, up the west coast of Westeros to the Iron Islands, and defeats the Iron Fleet on open water. I mean, that's a huge deal, because the Iron Fleet is... Well, I mean, you don't get named the Iron anything if you're a pushover, do you? They were supposed to be the big dogs in this fight, the Greyjoy's ace in the hole, and with that fleet gone, there's not much left to do except take care of the ground forces on the islands, which Robert and Ned are happy to do. Robert marches north with his army, Ned marches south with his, they meet up near the neck, join their armies together, and then, since, thanks to Stannis, there's no Ironborn forces guarding the sea anymore, they invade the Iron Islands. They destroy the capital city, Lordsport, and use siege engines to knock Balon's castle into a pile of gray and wet rubble. They have their army go sweeping over the ruins, and then Ned and Robert literally storm into Balon's throne room, capture Balon, and just like that, the rebellion is over. And Maester Garcia II actually has a description of Balon's surrender that I'm going to share with you now. Garcia says, quote, "The reborn kingdom of the Iron Isles had lasted less than a year, yet when Balon Greyjoy was brought before King Robert in chains, the Iron Man remained defiant. 'You may take my head,' he told the king, 'but you cannot name me traitor. No Greyjoy ever swore an oath to a Baratheon.' Robert Baratheon, ever merciful, is said to have laughed at that, for he liked spirit in a man, even in his foes. 'Swear one now,' he replied, 'or lose that stubborn head of yours.' And so Balon Greyjoy bent his knee and was allowed to live after giving up his last surviving son as a hostage to his loyalty." End quote. The Iron Islands had always been a problem for the rest of Westeros. They're like the bad kid at school, who everybody knows just to stay clear of because sooner or later they're going to get into some trouble. So I have a theory that when Balon launched his rebellion, most people in Westeros assumed that it was just the Iron Islands acting up again. A little bit wilder than usual, but basically the same kind of Ironborn crazy behavior that they'd come to expect from them over the millennia. And that's a completely understandable way of looking at it. But consider what Balon says to Robert. The part about never swearing allegiance to a Baratheon? I mean, he's right. His family didn't swear fealty to whoever happened to be sitting on the Iron Throne at the moment. They swore fealty to the Targaryens. Which might seem like a small thing, but to me, it suggests that this rebellion wasn't just another same old Ironborns being crazy type situation. It was the check engine light coming on for the entire country. Now, again, I feel the need to point out that I'm not a Westerosi historian, simply a fan of Westerosi history, so I could very well be wrong about that. But if I'm right, well, it's only because I'm able to look back on what happened years later. I mean, people who were there, people who actually lived through it, well, it would be incredibly easy to just write it off as the Ironborn being the Ironborn. Because again, this was the first serious problem in the 7 years of a Targaryen-free Westeros. And after Balon surrenders, things would continue to be fine for another 9 years. And when you measure one little rebellion against 16 years of peace, well, it's easy to look at it as an anomaly and not as a warning sign. Before his rebellion, Balon had 3 sons. By the time it's over, he's down to 1. One died in battle, and the other died when Robert's siege engines made several tons of castle wall fall on his head. The remaining son, and now de facto Greyjoy heir, is a 10-year-old kid named Theon, and as part of the terms of Baelin's surrender, he's sent to live as ward of the Starks at Winterfell. Although this isn't quite as benevolent of a warding situation as when young Tywin Lannister went to live at King's Landing, or when Ned and Robert were sent to the Vale. Theon is really more of a hostage, a way of making sure that if Baelin ever gets the rebellion itch again, that he keeps it to himself. Like I said, after Baelin Greyjoy is forced to swear fealty to Robert, things just go back to normal, for 9 years. On the surface, it was a great time for Westeros. There were no wars, no winters, no crazy monarchs, and it was a particularly good time for Ned Stark. One of the little ironies in this story is that, over the course of his life, Ned consistently finds himself in the middle of world-changing events, but when you read about him, he really just comes across as sort of a homebody. You know, like a soccer dad stuck in a great lord's life. I mean, sure, he spends a lot of time dethroning kings and quashing rebellions, but if Ned had his way, he'd just be at home with his family, hanging out in front of the fireplace, telling stories about the age of heroes to his kids. And by this point, it's kids with an S. You might remember that during Robert's rebellion, he married Catelyn Tully of Riverrun, Hoster Tully's eldest daughter, and that the two of them had it was a somewhat unusual beginning. Catelyn had been engaged to Ned's older brother, Brandon. Then Brandon was murdered by the king, so Ned vowed revenge and married Catelyn to get her father's troops, stuck around for 2 weeks, got her pregnant, left to overthrow the government, showed back up a year later, which is when Catelyn introduces Ned to their new son Robb, and Ned introduces her to his new bastard Jon. Not exactly your classic meet-cute type situation, is it? But, despite all that, in the years since, they've really grown to love and respect one another. I mean, Ned's a sincere and thoughtful guy, and Catelyn's a strong, thoughtful woman. And by this point, they've got 5 kids, 3 boys and 2 girls. I mean, they're a popular power couple in the North. Well-liked, well-respected, their vassals are all more or less happy. It's really sort of a Coach and Tammy Taylor situation going on. And even though the Stark words are, "Winter is coming," it's been summer for 9 years, so things are pretty good. And they stay that way until 299 AC, when one day, 9 years after Greyjoy's rebellion and 16 years after Robert's, Ned is out on a ride with a few of his sons. There's Robb, who at this point is 14 years old and the heir to Winterfell, the bastard Jon Snow, who's about the same age, and then Bran, Ned's second son, who's 9. Just a day like any other, taking in the countryside, executing a criminal, regular bonding time with Dad. And then they come across something in the snow. And you know, I should mention that even though it's summer in Westeros, it still snows in the north, because it's always cold up there, so just imagine how bad the winters are. But back to that something in the snow. It's the body of a direwolf. And in case you've never seen one before, I mean, direwolves are basically super wolves. They're the $6 million man of wolves. Bigger, faster, stronger, all of that. It's rumored that they can grow to be the size of small horses. So they're an animal that kind of commands respect just from the sheer terror that comes along from seeing one. Speaking of which, up until that afternoon, nobody in Westeros had seen one in hundreds of years. And yet, here's one now, dead in the snow. And the cause of death? Well, it was the antler of a large stag. A tine that had been snapped off in a fight and jammed through the direwolf's skull. And as soon as Ned and his party realize that, well, everything stops. It's like time freezes. Because to them, this is no longer just a dead animal. It's a sign. A bad sign. You see, direwolves are the sigil of House Stark, and stags are the sigil of House Baratheon. And the oddness of the situation doesn't stop there. The direwolf isn't the only thing lying in the snow. Just before she died, or just after, which is a bit of a creepy thought, but she had given birth to 5 pups, 3 boys and 2 girls, the same number as Ned's kids. And so, even though a lot of his men are arguing that the puppies should be killed, what with them being deadly wild animals and all, Ned decides to let each of his children have one. He puts a lot of stock in the old gods, and to him it seems like, based on the numbers, for whatever reason, the old gods want his kids to have these dire wolves. And there's also a sixth puppy, an albino runt that got separated from the rest of the litter, and that one goes to Jon Snow. Now, I'm not one to invest much in signs. I could get a fortune cookie that had my name, social security number, and address on it, and I would just say, well, that's an interesting coincidence. So I like to think that if I'd been there, that I would have just brushed it all off. I mean, accidents do happen after all, and you can't spend your life reading too deeply into things. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes a dead direwolf with an antler in its neck is just a dead direwolf with an antler in its neck. So I hope that if I had been there in the snow, I would have argued that the whole thing was just a creepy coincidence. But given what happens next, I might have been wrong. Because when the party returns to Winterfell, there's a letter waiting for Ned from Robert Baratheon. And it says that Jon Arryn, the man who fostered them both when they were kids, who had defied Mad King Aerys to keep them safe, and who had served as Robert's hand for the past 16 years, has died. 2 weeks ago, he was as strong as an ox. Then he got sick and was gone, just like that. This is not only sad news for Ned, but also for Catelyn. Her younger sister, Lysa Tully, was Jon Arryn's wife. She's the mother of his only son and heir, a 6-year-old boy named Robert. So this is a lot of bad news for the two of them to take in. But it's levied, somewhat, by the fact that the letter also says that King Robert Baratheon, first of his name and old war buddy of Ned's, is coming to Winterfell. He doesn't say why he's coming, but Ned and Catelyn are smart enough to figure that part out on their own. Jon Arryn had been Hand of the King since Robert took the throne, and now that he's gone, Robert will be looking for a replacement, and Ned has a perfect resume. He's Robert's oldest friend, he's a great lord, he's comfortable with power, and if things had shaken out just a little bit differently, he might have been king himself. On paper, it seems like it would be foolish to offer the job to anybody else. Now, it takes Robert a while to make his way up to Winterfell, because it's not like he can just hop on a horse and head up by himself. They've got a saying in Westeros, where the king goes, the realm follows, and moving a realm takes some time. You've got hundreds of knights, lords, ladies, not to mention merchants and hangers-on. People who attach themselves to the royal procession, because not only is it a good way to make a little bit of money, but it's also a story that they'll be able to tell for the rest of their lives. Because it's sort of like, it's a little bit like if the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade marched from New York to Los Angeles with Snoopy balloons and floats and the president. It's a spectacle. Heck, the wagon that was built for the royal family is so large that it can't even fit through a castle's gate. And that's just one wagon out of dozens. Oh, and speaking of the royal family, they're coming north too. When Robert won the throne, he was just a warhammer-swinging bachelor king. But those days are long gone. After his coronation, he got married to Cersei Lannister, the only daughter of Tywin Lannister. And similar to Ned and Cat, their marriage was political in nature. It was set up by Jon Arryn as a way of tying the Lannisters closer to the new king. But unlike Ned and Cat, their marriage has never been a happy one. Essentially because, one, neither of them seems like an easy person to be married to in general, and on top of that, they just don't seem to like one another very much. And that hasn't stopped them from sort of having 3 kids together. There's their eldest, Joffrey Baratheon, and he's 12 years old and the crown prince of Westeros. Then there's a 9-year-old daughter, Myrcella, and their youngest, a 7-year-old boy named Tommen. And they're all in that giant wagon heading north to see Ned. Now, I don't know if this has happened to you, but I have a few friends that I grew up with, and we swore we'd always keep in touch and be a band of brothers till the end and all of that sort of thing. But now, years later, even though I still feel a bond with them, our biggest form of communication is when one of us likes a photo of the other one's kids on Facebook. And it's interesting that the same thing can happen to friends who conquered a country together. Minus the Facebook part, obviously, but by and large, after Greyjoy's rebellion, Ned and Robert's friendship sort of hits that same sort of post-high school fog, I guess you could call it. They've graduated, left the Eyrie, and moved on. And even though they stay in touch via Raven, both of them are just very busy with their own lives. With Ned ruling the North and Robert ruling the kingdom, and they just sort of naturally grow apart. Additionally, I spend a ton of time reading about troubled periods of Westerosi history, times of war and famine and that sort of thing, and when huge numbers of people will travel thousands of miles for years. So it's easy to forget that during times of peace, traveling in general is actually pretty rare. I mean, doubly so for an introvert like Ned Stark, who, during the entirety of Robert's rule, hasn't ever gone south of the Neck. All of which is a long way of saying that when the royal party finally arrives in Winterfell, Ned barely even recognizes Robert. Meister Martin describes the scene, saying, quote, 15 years passed when they had ridden forth to win a throne. The Lord of Storm's End, meaning Robert, had been clean-shaven, clear-eyed, and muscled like a maiden's fantasy. 6.5 feet tall, he towered over lesser men, and when he donned his armor and the great antlered helmet of his house, he became a veritable giant. He'd had a giant's strength, too, his weapon of choice a spiked warhammer that Ned could barely lift. In those days, the smell of leather and blood had clung to him like perfume. Now it was perfume that clung to him like perfume, and he had a girth to match his height. Ned had last seen the king 9 years before during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, when the stag and the direwolf had joined to end the pretensions of the self-proclaimed king of the Iron Islands. Since the night they had stood side by side in Greyjoy's fallen stronghold, where Robert had accepted the rebel lord's surrender and Ned had taken his son Theon as hostage and ward, the king had gained at least 8 stone. A beard as coarse and black as iron wire covered his jaw to hide his double chin and the sag of the royal jowls, but nothing could hide his stomach or the dark circles under his eyes. End quote. When you're a man of large appetites, getting a job that gives you an unlimited buffet of power, well, that's not always a good thing, is it? I mean, some people need limits in their life. Robert is one of them, but part of his job title is basically not having any limits. And the power that gives him, well, it's taking its toll. Now, there are some other important people in the royal party. Cersei wasn't the only Lannister who traveled north. So did her twin brother, whose name should, hopefully by this point, be familiar, Jaime Lannister. Now, the last time we saw Jaime, he was busy saving King's Landing from destruction by slitting the Mad King's throat. And when he rides into Winterfell, unlike Robert, he looks like he hasn't changed a bit. He's still incredibly handsome, still the mirror image of his sister the Queen, still in the Kingsguard, which is a fact that puzzles some people, as he's the only living person who's actually killed a king. Seems like that might get you fired from a job where you're trying to prevent that from happening. But after the rebellion, Robert pardoned him, and so he's A-okay so far as they're concerned. After all, he is a great fighter, and besides, it must be hard to fire someone when you just married their sister. And finally, joining his siblings in the north is Tyrion Lannister. Now, we haven't talked about Tyrion in a while. He's the youngest of Lord Tywin's children, the dwarf whose mother died giving birth to him. People used to call him Lord Tywin's Bane and things like that. Although, now that he's grown up a bit, I think at this point he's 28 years old, 29, somewhere in that area. But nowadays he's mostly known as the Imp. And at this point, he's famous for his appearance and last name, but aside from that, nobody really knows anything about him. And so, when he waddles into the courtyard of Winterfell, people say hello, give the son of a great lord his due, and then after that, he's pretty much ignored. So that's the royal party that rolls into Ned's front yard. And over the next few days, there's a couple of important things that happen. The first is that Robert asks Ned to be his hand. And even though he knew it was coming and he's had some time to get used to the idea, Ned doesn't want to take the job. Mostly because it would destroy the life he's spent the past 16 years building. I mean, he'd have to move to King's Landing, which is thousands of leagues away, and on top of that, he'd have to deal with a court that's overflowing with political intrigue. I mean, people who are always trying to get something from you or the king, backstabbing, gossip, murder occasionally, all of that stuff. It's not the type of place for an introvert whose idea of a pleasant afternoon is hanging out by himself next to a weirwood and thinking about his ancestors. And it's not like Ned is the only one fit for the job. I mean, heck, Stannis Baratheon would be perfect. For starters, he's the king's brother, and family ties aside, the guy's got a great track record. Now, you'll remember that during Robert's rebellion, he survived a year-long siege from one of the most powerful, albeit dopiest, lords in the realm, Mace Tyrell, and saved Storm's End from falling into enemy hands. And during the Greyjoy rebellion, he beat the Iron Fleet on the open sea, something that all of recorded Westerosi history says is incredibly difficult to do. And on top of that, he's already been working in the government for years as the master of ships. He'd be a terrific hand of the king. The only problem is that Robert doesn't really like him. Sees him as kind of a stick in the mud. Renly tells an amusing, but colorful for those of you at work, story that sort of highlights the differences between the two brothers. At some point, Stannis had suggested outlawing brothels and prostitution in all of King's Landing because he found them morally distasteful. And when Robert gets wind of that idea, his response was to ask Stannis if he'd like to go ahead and outlaw eating, shitting, and breathing while he was at it. So, Robert doesn't particularly care for Stannis. But he loves Ned. More importantly, he trusts Ned. And so if the hand has got to be someone other than Jon Arryn, because Jon Arryn's dead, as far as Robert's concerned, there's only one option. It's got to be Ned Stark. And as a way of sweetening the offer, he suggests that Ned's eldest daughter, Sansa, get betrothed to his son Joffrey. Which means, from Robert's point of view, he just offered Ned the opportunity to become not only the second most powerful person in the realm, but also the future grandfather of kings. I mean, that sounds like a pretty great deal, right? Tough to turn down. Well, Ned still isn't sold on it. He asks for some time to think it over. And that night, he's talking to his wife, Catelyn, and he basically says, "Gods, can you believe it? There's no way I'm taking that stupid job, right?" Well, much to his surprise, Catelyn disagrees. I mean, to her mind, Ned's looking at this offer like it's coming from a friend. But from her point of view, Robert isn't the same guy that Ned grew up with. He's a king now, and he's been one for years. And that, well, it changes a person. Sometimes for the better, but sometimes for the worse. And so treating Robert like an old war buddy, that's a mistake, and a dangerous one. Say no to Robert's generous offer, and pretty soon he'll start to wonder why. And that wonder will turn to suspicion, and eventually that suspicion will turn into confrontation. So they're talking this over when they get interrupted by their Maester, a man by the name of Luwin. He's the guy who teaches the Stark children, heals the sick, and over the years has become a pretty trusted advisor of Ned and Catelyn's. And he's there because someone in the royal party left a letter on his desk. And it must be important, because whomever sent it went to a lot of trouble to keep it secret. First, they delivered it without being seen. Second, it was hidden inside of the secret chamber of a little wooden box. And third, the message is written in a mysterious language. A language that only 2 people in the entire realm can read. One of whom, as luck would have it, happens to be Catelyn Stark. And the other one is her younger sister, Lysa Arryn, Jon Arryn's wife, or new widow. And it's written in this language the 2 of them invented when they were children together at River Run, a sort of 2-person pig Latin. And that's a lot of precaution for just one little note. But it turns out to be warranted. More than warranted. This is a letter that cannot fall into the wrong hands. Because it's not just a letter, it's an accusation. Lysa is writing to let Catelyn know, to warn her, that Jon Arryn didn't die of natural causes. He was murdered by the Lannisters, and specifically by the Queen. I mean, that's a huge accusation. And it's not being made by some random conspiratorial group of small folk either. I mean, this isn't like someone saying that the Field of Fire was an inside job. No. Lysa Arryn is the widow of the Hand of the King. One day her son is going to be the Lord of the Vale. If she's saying this stuff, well, then it can't be ignored. At the very least, it warrants an investigation. And if her accusations are true, if the Queen was involved in murdering Jon Arryn, well, then there are going to be huge ramifications. And there are, starting with Ned, who's inclined to believe her. Because remember, Ned doesn't think too much of the Lannisters, specifically Jaime and Tywin, who, during Robert's rebellion, sacked King's Landing, killed the king, and murdered, brutally, Rhaegar's children, one of whom was an infant. I mean, as far as Eddard Stark was concerned, that made them war criminals, and he wanted them treated as such. He wanted trials, and he wanted punishment. And the only reason they were spared is because Robert used his newfound powers as king to give them a pass. And that sat so poorly with Ned that he came very close to never speaking to Robert again. So even though there isn't any hard evidence to support Lysa's claim, Ned's willing to entertain the idea that the note's telling the truth. But it's not like he can just run over to Robert and say, "Hey, your wife's family murdered our sort of dad." No. If he's going to present this theory to the king, he's got to get proof. And it has to be absolutely ironclad. And in order to do that, he's got to go to King's Landing. Not only that, but he's got to go as someone who has the authority to ask a lot of people a lot of questions. And the best way for him to do that is to accept Robert's job offer and become the hand of the king. It'll give him the power he needs, and it'll let him keep an eye on Robert. Because if Jon Arryn was murdered, well, then it's a safe bet that maybe the king can't be too far behind. So the next day, he tells Robert that his answer is yes, and Ned Stark becomes the hand of the king. And as soon as he does that, the life that he and Catelyn built over the last decade is over. His family is being broken apart, literally. Because Ned's not the only Stark going to King's Landing. He's taking his daughters, too. Sansa, because, well, she's going to be queen one day and she'll need to get used to life at court and high society in general. And Arya's going because she's a bit wild, to put it mildly. And the hope is that maybe life in the city will help her take on some more Sansian qualities, make her more ladylike. And he's also taking Bran. Ever since the king's arrival at Winterfell, Joffrey and Robb have been arguing, mostly about sword fighting and other teenage boy-type stuff, but arguing nonetheless. And any animosity with a future king is a bad idea. Since Bran is such a nice kid, the hope is that he'll be able to befriend the royal children and maybe help bring the families closer together. Besides, it's a good learning opportunity for Bran. He's spent his entire life wanting to be a knight, and at King's Landing he'll be surrounded by them. Meanwhile, Bran's older brother Robb will stay in the north. He's only a few years away from being a man grown, and he needs to get some practice in it being a ruler in his own right. Because one day he's going to be the Lord of Winterfell. Catelyn will stay to help him. And the youngest of the Stark children, a 3-year-old boy named Rickon, he'll stay in the north too. Partly because he still needs to learn the ways of the Starks, but also because, as I'm sure Ned knows, traveling with a 3-year-old is just a nightmare experience, and if you can leave them at home, you do. That's just common sense, no matter where you're from. The next few days are filled with people prepping for the trip south to King's Landing. It's a big job moving the royal family, not to mention a great lord and 3 of his children, and there are arrangements to be made, chests and wagons full of goods to pack. Employees of the Starks, the ones who will be moving south with them at least, need to make sure that their own households are taken care of. Servants have to make sure that giant wagon is oiled up and ready to go. There's just a ton of work to be done. Still, despite it being chaotic, the preparations are going pretty well. Until Bran Stark falls out of a tower window. And this isn't some minor thing, like when a kid falls off his bike and winds up with a scraped knee and a bruised ego. I mean, a tower window at Winterfell, it's like falling off of a 10-story building. And somehow, Bran survives. I mean, not even the Meisters can figure out how he's still alive. He should be dead, and he's not that far off. The fall knocked him into a coma. His back is shattered. His legs are both broken and twisted into these horrible, grotesque shapes. Which means that, well, one, nobody knows if he'll ever wake up, but everyone agrees that if he does, there's no chance of him walking ever again. And while everyone is crushed by this development, nobody's really that surprised. Bran had a bit of a reputation as a climber, which is not unusual for an 8-year-old boy growing up in a castle, I'd imagine. But apparently he was like some sort of medieval Spider-Man and would spend most of his free time scampering around the walls and roofs of Winterfell. He'd gotten in trouble for it before. His parents were always worried that he'd fall and hurt himself. And sadly, it looks like this time they were right. Except they weren't. Bran didn't fall out of that tower window. He was thrown out of that tower window. Of course, at the time, nobody could possibly know that, as Bran was in a coma, and, well, if you're the kind of person who's willing to throw an 8-year-old out of a window, you're probably not the kind of person who's going to feel so guilty about it that you turn yourself in as soon as it happens. Speaking of which, what sort of monster throws an 8-year-old out of a window? Well, sadly, in this case, it was a monster whose name you already know. Jaime Lannister. When Ned saw Jaime ride into Winterfell, he probably thought that nothing had changed, that Jaime was still, from Ned's point of view at least, the arrogant young man he'd found sitting on the Iron Throne 16 years earlier. But he'd be wrong, because at this point, Jaime's looks, they're camouflage. Gorgeous camouflage, but camouflage nonetheless, hiding something much more sinister. In the last episode, I brought up a theory of mine that when Jaime killed Arya Targaryen, it was almost like he got infected by the king's madness. And all these years later, it's easy to see that the infection's first casualties were the values and character that, as a young man, steered Jaime towards being a knight in the first place. Some sense of, well, call it honor or justice or chivalry even, but the parts of him that actually believed in the idealism that knighthood represented, they're gone. Or at least so neglected that they might as well be. Have you ever bitten into a healthy-looking piece of fruit, only to find out that the inside's gone bad? Well, that's sort of what Jaime's turned into. He's a knight with a great smile, hiding a soul that's given itself over to rot. Still, that's not to say that he was just, wandering around the castle looking for a kid to throw out of a window and then, oh, hey, here's Bran Stark, let's go. No, he had as far as these things go at least, he had a reason for doing it. Which brings us to Cersei Lannister. Now, Cersei's a tough person to figure out. On the one hand, she's an intelligent, strong-willed woman fighting to get just a little bit of independence in a world that views her as little more than a blonde-haired, childbearing machine. On the other hand, she also seems to be cruel, petty, and maybe even a little bit insane. Whereas Jaime is someone who was, to borrow a phrase from Ernest Hemingway, broken by the world, Cersei seems to have come into it a little bit broken already. And so when I read about her actions, it can be difficult to figure out just which of her personality traits are informing her decisions, the good or the little bit insane. That said, one thing that's absolutely clear about her is that she loves Jaime. And despite all the good things that the years have stripped away from him, Jaime loves her too. And it's more than just familial love. Because not only are they siblings, but they're also identical twins, best friends, and lovers. And they have been for years. By this point, it's actually decades. Apparently, it started when they were both living at Casterly Rock, and then when Cersei married Robert, well, it just kept on going. And this is obviously something that they have to keep to themselves, because unless your last name rhymes with Schmargarian, incest is a major no-no in Westeros. But it pales in comparison to the crimes, I guess, that Jaime and Cersei's incest has led to. The 3 royal children of Robert and Cersei's, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen? Robert's not their father. Jaime is. The Targaryens built the Iron Throne with willpower and dragons. Robert won it with a nation's worth of armies. And now the Lannisters are going to steal it by slapping the name Baratheon on their kids and letting time do the rest. They're winning a crown with a mummers show. Which, having children out of incest, and then positioning those children so that one of them will someday inherit the throne and consequently end the bloodline of the legitimate king, that's not just a crime. That's treason of the highest order. It's something that could open the door to Armageddon. And to Jaime and Cersei's credit, they know it, and they are very committed to keeping their dalliances hidden from, everybody. They're playing with sexual wildfire here, and no one, absolutely no one, can know about it. And that's why, whenever they need to be together, they take enormous pains making sure that nobody finds out. So, for instance, if, say, they're up at Winterfell with the entire court, they won't just sneak off somewhere to be together. No, they're not that stupid. They'll wait until Robert and Ned go off on a hunting trip and take most of the royal party with them. And then, once they're sure they're gone, they'll find some place isolated. Somewhere, say, like a very tall, very remote tower that nobody really uses. And then they'll lock the door to make sure that there's no possible way that anyone can accidentally walk in on them and see them doing their thing. That's the level of precaution they need to take, and it's the level of precaution that they do take. Unfortunately, even the best laid plans can't factor in the possibility that an 8-year-old with a penchant for climbing might get bored while everyone else is out hunting, decide to scale a tower wall for fun, and peek in the window while you're busy, ending the king's bloodline, as it were. But that's exactly what happened. Bran catches the Lannisters in the act. And they catch him catching them in the act. And when that happens, they don't really have a ton of options. If he says anything about it to anyone, Cersei's dead, Jaime's dead, and their 3 children are dead too. Heck, the whole Lannister family could be brought down by something like this. And despite the moral decay that he's succumbed to lately, I have to believe that if it were just him, that somehow he had a choice between just him dying and throwing a child out of a window, I think Jaime would choose to die. But he wouldn't ever let anything happen to Cersei. And that's why, moments after he catches Bran by the arm, he throws him out the tower window. Of course, when he did that, Jaime expected Bran to die. So 2 weeks later, when Bran is still alive, albeit in a coma, Jaime and Cersei are pretty frustrated. Easy to understand why, right? Their entire future depends on whether or not this kid recovers and is able to remember anything of what he saw. Still, there's not a lot they can do. There's not a lot that anyone can do besides wait to see if Bran wakes up, and the Meisters are saying that it's entirely possible that might not ever happen. which is why Robert insists that it's time to return to King's Landing. There's been no change in Bran's condition for weeks. Ned can't help him one way or the other, and he and Robert have a kingdom they need to run. So, after a lot of tearful goodbyes, the king and his new hand head south, and the realm follows, leaving Bran behind. As you might imagine, the trip back to King's Landing is not an easy one, for two big reasons. The first is that this is when Robert starts discussing matters of state with Ned. Or rather, one matter of state that has to do with something near and dear to Robert's heart: killing Targaryens. After Robert killed Rhaegar on the Trident, Aerys packed up his pregnant wife and young son Viserys and sent them both to Dragonstone. Within the year, his wife, the ex-queen, would die there while giving birth to Aerys' first and only daughter, a girl named Daenerys. So when Robert seized the throne, there were two legitimate Targaryen heirs just off the coast. That's like if King's Landing were in Miami, then Viserys and Daenerys are just sitting there in Havana. It's right next door. And Robert knew that as long as any of Aerys' descendants were still alive, his position as king would always be at risk. So he sent Stannis to Dragonstone with a fleet of ships to conquer the island and take care of the last of the Targaryens. It was a close-run thing, but just before Stannis' fleet arrives, Viserys and Daenerys are shuttled away to Essos by Targaryen loyalists. And ever since then, they've been moving around the Free Cities, trying to lay low and avoid anyone loyal to Robert Baratheon. And you know, if anything, their time in Essos has shown them to be, well, just not much of a threat. I mean, nobody's really interested in rallying behind either one of them. The only thing of value that they have is their last name, and that's barely enough to get by. I mean, so much so that Viserys is known as the Beggar King, as he's always asking for help, or food, or shelter, or trying to rally support behind his last name and get an army together to retake the Iron Throne. And while someone like Rhaegar might have been able to pull off that kind of a plan, Viserys doesn't have much of a chance. He's one of the wild-card Targaryens. Cruel, entitled, bitter, all that stuff. People just don't like the guy. Nobody is sure about Daenerys, though. I mean, at this point she's only 13, and she spent most of her time being bullied by Viserys and hiding from a Westerosi king she's never met who wants her dead. Now, there are these nomadic tribes in Essos known as the Dothraki. They're a horse-based culture that travel around looting, pillaging, and fighting, and it's their fighting ability that make them, at least in Essos, terrifying. I mean, they're a lot like the Mongols, in that they're such good riders and so good with a bow that when you put the two together, they become this unstoppable enemy that nobody knows how to defend against. They're just this sort of force of nature, like a hurricane or something, that sweeps in out of the wilderness once in a while, causes a bunch of destruction, then disappears again. Now, one of the bigger Dothraki tribes, about 100,000 strong, is led by a man named Drogo. Well, the Dothrakis have an honorific for their leaders, so actually it's called Drogo, but this is what Robert wants to talk to Ned about. Because Viserys, and basically the only successful thing he's ever done, has just arranged a marriage between Khal Drogo and Daenerys. Drogo gets a royal wife, and in return, he'll help Viserys retake the Iron Throne. Although, that's sort of an empty promise on Drogo's part. Because when it comes to fighting, the Dothraki do have one major deal breaker. They're terrified of salt water. Of the oceans. They refuse to have anything to do with them, which means transporting their troops by boats, that's never going to happen. As far as the Dothraki are concerned, those boats are just little wooden floating extensions of the sea, which, I mean, I just can't help but be amused by. I mean, these are people who are considered to be the scariest thing in the world, and the scariest thing in the world to them is a day at the beach. All of that means that, promise to Viserys or no, they just aren't a threat to the Seven Kingdoms. Because thanks to the Children of the Forest, or much more likely a earthquake or tsunami or something like that, but the land bridge that once connected Essos to Westeros is long gone. So now there's no way to get between the two continents except by crossing the ocean, period. But that doesn't really register with Robert, because the Dothraki army isn't the only thing he's worried about. He's pretty sure that Daenerys getting married to Drogo means that she's about to get pregnant. And if she gets pregnant and has a son, well, Robert's rebellion was only 16 years ago, which means there are still a whole lot of people in the realm who once fought against Robert and would gladly support a Targaryen usurper. I mean, one who wasn't a dud like Viserys, obviously. But especially if that theoretical Targaryen somehow managed to arrive on the shores of Westeros with an army of horse-riding, bow-shooting Dothraki killing machines, well, that theoretical Targaryen might get a lot of support indeed. And while Robert was happy to let the two Targaryens wander around Essos and beg for help, this marriage is a deal breaker for him. He doesn't want to ignore them any longer. He wants them dead. And, as usual, Ned thinks that Robert is overreacting. He's thinking with his warhammer instead of his head. Because when Ned looks at the situation, he doesn't see a threat to the throne. He sees a 13-year-old girl who isn't pregnant and just married into a family that hates the ocean. I mean, there's no legitimate threat here, and even if there was, Ned won't condone or support the killing of an innocent child, ever, period, end of story. The two of them argue about this for a while, then agree to file it away for another day. It's not a huge issue, yet. And besides, there are other problems that they've got to deal with. Speaking of which, the second big thing that happens on the trip back to King's Landing has to do with Joffrey, the 12-year-old crown prince and future king of Westeros. My mother used to have an expression about one of the troubled kids in my neighborhood, and I think if she ever met Joffrey, she'd probably think it applied to him too, and say, there's just something not quite right about that Baratheon boy. I mean, to most of the world, Joffrey seems like a model prince. Tall for his age, looks just like his mother, and father, for that matter. He's charming, intelligent, everything you'd want royalty to be. But reading about him, and what he does later, it seems like all of that stuff, it's just a mask. It's a mask that he wears when he's around other people. Like he knew that that's how a prince is supposed to behave. And up until this point, nobody, or at least nobody from the north, nobody even knows that he's hiding his true nature. I mean, sure, he was kind of a jerk to Robb back at Winterfell, but he's a 12-year-old kid. Being a jerk comes with the territory. But it's on this trip that we briefly see past the whole Prince Charming act and get our first glimpses of the real Joffrey. And the real Joffrey seems like someone who might be less Prince Charming and more, well, someone interested in indulging their crueler, more sadistic tendencies. One day, when the royal party is just a few weeks south of Winterfell, Sansa and Joffrey go out for a ride. Just the two of them talking, getting to know each other, taking in the countryside that they'll one day rule with absolute power, you know, that sort of stuff. When they stumble onto Arya Stark, Sansa's younger sister. She's playing with another kid, the son of a butcher who attached himself to the royal party, and the two of them are fake sword fighting with sticks, just harmless stuff. And that's when Joffrey decides to have a little fun. Or at least, what he considers fun. He pulls out his sword, his real sword, mind you, and starts tormenting the butcher's boy, pressing the point of his blade into the boy's cheek, daring him to strike the prince, that sort of thing. Now, Arya, who you'll remember earlier we mentioned has a bit of a temper, Arya won't stand for it. She jumps on Joffrey and tries to pull him away, but he's a lot older, a lot bigger, and so he easily just tosses her off, which normally is not that big of a deal, right? Little girl jumps on you, you push her aside, and then keep tormenting her friend. That's just schoolyard bullying 101. The difference here is that most little girls don't have a pet dire wolf, but Arya does. And those dire wolves that Ned found in the snow, they're not helpless pups anymore. It's only been a few weeks and they're already, well, they're not only as big as full-grown dogs, but they're also fanatically loyal to the Stark children. So when Arya's wolf, who's named Nymeria, when Nymeria sees Joffrey shove Arya to the ground, she attacks him. Nothing major, just a light bite on the arm and a little bit of shaking, but it's enough to knock Joffrey off his feet. And jerk 12-year-old or no, he's still the crown prince, and you can't let your pet direwolf attack the crown prince without there being repercussions. Arya realizes that she's in a lot of trouble, and so she, the butcher boy, and Nymeria, they all take off into the woods. Meanwhile, Sansa sticks behind, and when she tries to help Joffrey to his feet, she gets her first glimpse behind that mask of his. And what does she see? Massive hatred and cruelty just pouring out of his eyes. He is furious, and unfortunately for Sansa, it won't be the last time she sees him this way. A few days later, after the search parties have found Arya, all the kids have to go in front of Robert and explain what happened. Arya tells the truth, but nobody really believes her, especially since Joffrey just flat out lies about the whole thing. Says Arya and Nymeria attacked him out of the blue, and for no reason at all. And Sansa, well, Sansa's too scared to tell the truth, so she does the kid equivalent of pleading the fifth. Robert doesn't really believe Joffrey, and dealing with stuff like this isn't his strong suit anyway, so he lets Arya off the hook. Mostly. But Cersei's not so easily cowed. She demands that Arya's direwolf be killed, Too dangerous to have running around and all of that. I mean, it attacked the prince. Never mind that up until a few months ago, direwolves were as rare as dragons. The only problem is that Nymeria disappeared into the woods. So instead, Sansa's direwolf lady gets killed in her place. Now, Sansa, understandably, is absolutely devastated and just furious with her father and Arya. But what about the butcher boy? Joffrey's personal bodyguard is a man named Sandor Clegane, the younger brother of Gregor Clegane, who we discussed in the last episode. He was one of the guys that slaughtered Rhaegar's family during the sack of King's Landing. And while Sandor Clegane's not nearly as evil as his brother, I mean, that's kind of damning with faint praise, but he's still a brutal, brutal human being. And he takes orders directly from Joffrey, who, as we've just seen, is not exactly a great guy himself. Well, Sandor's one of the guys sent out to find the butcher boy and bring him back to the royal camp. And when Sandor finds him, he rides him down, cuts him nearly in half, and shoves him in a bag to rot. We're told that when the boy's body is presented to his family, it was so thoroughly mutilated that his father mistook it for a slaughtered pig. It's awful and barbaric, but also revealing. Whatever lies behind Joffrey's mask, well, it's capable of taking a pleasant day and turning it into something truly vile, with a checklist that includes tormenting a stranger, lying to a king, having a direwolf killed, and an innocent kid chopped nearly in half. Sort of a sneak preview of what the realm can hope to expect from the reign of King Joffrey Baratheon. So, needless to say, by the time he gets to King's Landing, Ned is exhausted. He just finished the road trip from hell, and he's about to start a new job. I mean, it must have seemed like he was having the worst week out of anyone highborn at least, in all of Westeros. But of course, he isn't. That dubious honor belongs to his wife. After Ned left for King's Landing, Winterfell was just not a very happy place to be. Bran was in a Lannister-induced coma, and Catelyn, who'd been nearly catatonic with grief, hadn't left his side in weeks, which wasn't good for anybody, because with Ned gone, she was the one in charge of keeping Winterfell running smoothly, which is a ton of responsibility. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen Downton Abbey, but that family's entire job is basically just looking after their huge estate. And while I don't have the exact acreage in front of me, I think it's safe to say that Winterfell makes Downton Abbey look like a storage locker. So Cat really needs to be involved in the day-to-day operations, not to mention the fact that she also has a 3-year-old to look after and a teenage son who needs help learning how to rule, the northern half of the 7 kingdoms. But none of that matters to her. Heck, she might not even be aware of it. I mean, she's shell-shocked, and in a way, she's just as broken as Bran. And so things stay in this sort of, this grief-fueled purgatory for weeks. Now, let's say you were an assassin, and you wanted to get a bunch of guards and a grieving mother away from a specific room in a castle. How would you do it? Would you maybe light a fire on the other side of the castle and assume that everyone would run over to investigate? Do you think that would work? Well, the man sent to kill Bran Stark certainly thought it would. And after starting the fire, watching everyone run off to deal with it, and then waltzing into Bran's room without any opposition, he must have thought that he was a regular modern-day blood raven. But the one thing he didn't count on was Catelyn Stark. She's so overcome and distraught that not even a fire can make her leave Bran's side for long, and so she returns to his room to find the assassin about to live up to his job title. Not surprisingly, the would-be killer pivots away from Bran and attacks Catelyn. And if you're the kind of guy who's willing to kill a defenseless kid, you're not going to let something like a grieving mother get in your way. But she's not just a grieving mother. She's got weeks and weeks of pent-up anger over the unfairness of what happened to her son that's just dying to be unleashed on somebody. Unfortunately, anger like that doesn't do very much when the person attacking you has a dagger. And not just any dagger, but one with a blade made out of Valyrian steel, which means 2 things. First, that whomever sent this guy was well-connected. A dagger like that is as expensive as it is rare. And second, it means that Catelyn's in a lot of trouble. Because Valyrian steel is sharp. Past sharp. It's one step away from being a lightsaber. Still, Catelyn's not going down without a fight. She manages to grab the blade, which not only shreds her hands to bits, but also makes the assassin lose a few valuable seconds. And that's all the time Bran's direwolf needs to burst into the room, tackle him to the floor, grab him by the neck, and rip out his throat. And I mean, those direwolves really proved to be home-run pets almost immediately, didn't they? Cuddly and cute one minute, absolutely deadly the next. Sort of makes you wonder how the Starks ever got by without him. I mean, I grew up with a cockatoo named Derby, and while at the time I thought he was just the greatest pet ever, when I read about these direwolves, I start feeling like I might have gotten the short end of the pet stick. Regardless, the fight leaves Catelyn unconscious for a few days, and when she wakes up, even though her hands look like they got lost inside of a blender, she's actually doing pretty well. The attack knocked her out of her grief-induced fog, which is good, because there's a lot for her to do. Until now, everyone had just assumed that Bran fell from that tower on accident. But the fact that someone was sent to kill him? Well, that means, at least to Catelyn, that maybe Bran saw something that he shouldn't have. Maybe he didn't fall from that tower at all. Maybe someone tried to kill him, and when they failed, they sent someone else to finish the job. And adding some weight to that theory is the dagger. The assassin was a commoner, and commoners have no business owning a Valyrian steel blade of any size. That's like a broke 15-year-old shoplifter having a Ferrari as a getaway car. It just doesn't add up. There's no way a commoner could have gotten a dagger like that on their own, which means somebody gave it to him. Somebody powerful. And that's not all. Catelyn starts sort of searching through her memories and remembers that on the day that everyone had gone out to hunt, Jaime Lannister had stayed behind. And that might be just circumstantial evidence at best. But when you add in the fact that Catelyn's sister Lysa just wrote her a letter that accused the Lannisters of murdering Jon Arryn, well, as far as Catelyn's concerned, that makes the Jaime did it theory a whole heck of a lot less circumstantial. The problem is, there's nothing she can really do about it in Winterfell. In order to get anything done, she needs to go to the Red Keep. That's where Ned is, and that's where the Lannisters are. Once she gets there, she can fill Ned in, and they can try and figure out who exactly this dagger belonged to. It all has to be done in extreme secrecy, though. Because if there is a vast Lannister conspiracy at work, it would be beyond dangerous to let them know that she's headed their way. So she takes Winterfell's master-at-arms, heads to the North's biggest port, White Harbor, and charters a ship for King's Landing. Speaking of which, Ned's first few days on the job haven't been easy. In fact, more than anything, they've gone a long way towards proving that he was right about how much he disliked being Hand of the King. His days are a cycle of meetings and dealing with Robert's whims and navigating the political chessboard over and over and over again. It's like the world's biggest introvert was forced to go to the world's biggest party, and there's no way for him to leave. What's worse is that he's got to share power with a governmental entity known as the Small Council, which is sort of like the equivalent of an American president's cabinet. It's made up of a few appointees with very specific responsibilities who help the king and his hand govern the realm. Only in Robert's case, they don't really help govern the realm, they basically govern the realm. Because as Ned finds out on his first day on the job, Robert hasn't attended a small council meeting in years. He finds them boring. So instead of showing up, he'll just send down requests and expect the council members to make them happen, regardless of the consequences. And these council members are the people that Ned has to work with, and unfortunately, he's not sure that he can trust any of them. I mean, Ned respected Stannis Baratheon, and at times it feels like he's the only one who did. But after Robert left for the north, Stannis moved his family, his wife and little girl, to Dragonstone, which, as the master of ships, was an extremely unusual thing for him to do. Regardless, it's done, and Stannis is gone, from the city and the small council. You might remember the next few members, though. Grand Maester Pycelle is still around, as is Varys the Spider, the Master of Whispers. Then there's Barristan Selmy, Barristan the Bold, as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and he's on the council too. Now, Robert's youngest brother Renly is there, and he's just 21 years old and the Master of Laws. And last but not least, but perhaps most troubling of all, at least to Ned, is the Master of Coin, Peter Baelish, otherwise known as Littlefinger. We'll talk more about him in a minute, but just know that he and Ned have history, and the adjective that describes Littlefinger best is Machiavellian. And being separated from your family, living in a city you don't like, working with people you don't trust, knowing that your predecessor was probably murdered by your boss's wife, that can make for a lousy work environment. But in spite of all that, for Ned, I think the worst part of the job is that it's forcing him to come face to face with the fact that his friend Robert Baratheon is he's just kind of a terrible king. Now, as you may have figured out, I think Jon Arryn was a pretty good guy. And from all accounts, he was a really good hand. But in a lot of ways, he served the same function that Tywin did for Aerys. And what I mean by that is, his skill inadvertently served as a counterweight against the king's own decision-making abilities. I mean, Aerys, of course, was a bad monarch for reasons that involved torturing innocent people to death and threatening to blow up his capital city and just kind of rampant craziness, as it were. But Robert is bad in the sense that, well, it just seems like he doesn't really enjoy being the king. I mean, sure, he enjoys what it lets him do, the power, the respect, all of that stuff is great. But the actual governing of the realm, he hates it, thinks it's boring, a waste of time. Which is terrible news for the realm, because that's exactly what a king ought to be focusing on the most. Have you ever heard a police officer talk about how when a kid tells them that they want to grow up and become a cop, it's usually because they think it's just wall-to-wall gunfights and car chases and solving crimes and, all the stuff they see on TV. When in reality, what those kids don't realize is that there's a lot of downtime, there's a lot of paperwork, there's a lot of doing things that are actually very boring. I get the sense that Robert felt the same way about being a king. He imagined it to be some sort of almost non-stop adventure. Instead, it's almost non-stop bureaucracy. And while I certainly don't condone Robert's complete apathy towards the responsibilities of his position, I can understand where he's coming from. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. You're a warrior. You like to fight. The prince kidnaps your girlfriend and the king gives you a death sentence, so you wind up in the biggest fight of your life. And while you're riding that adrenaline high, your childhood friend and a respected father figure nominate you to become king when the fight's over. Well, how could you say no to that? And how could you possibly understand in the heat of the moment that being a king was going to be such a hard left turn from leading a rebellion? You can forgive Robert for not realizing that ruling Westeros and conquering Westeros were two very, very different beasts. The end result is the same, though. Robert's phoning it in. He's letting other people make the tough calls, while he basically self-medicates by overdosing on pleasure, food, alcohol, women, parties, tourneys, anything to alleviate the tedium of his life. And that kind of behavior, well, it trickles down. It infects the culture of the palace. It creates an environment that's ripe for corruption, where people with questionable morals can get into positions of power and cause all sorts of problems. And it literally bankrupts the realm. When Aerys died, say what you will about his kingship, but the treasury had a surplus. And now, due to Robert's indifference and appetites, the crown's heavily in debt. And I've got to think that this realization, that his friend was not doing a good job, well, that must have been hard on Ned. Because Ned was a major player in Robert's rebellion. I mean, he was one of the reasons it ever got off the ground. And his decision to do that, it had consequences. In order for Robert to sit on the Iron Throne, thousands of people had to die. An untold number of lives were destroyed. And at the time, Ned believed that the cost was worth it, that their cause was a noble one, that Robert was a rightful king. But now that he's seeing what all that pain and sacrifice led to, well, at the very least, it's got to be weighing on him a bit, and making an already bad job even worse. However, there is one silver lining, and that is that being the hand of the king has gone a long way in helping him solve the mystery of Jon Arryn and the untimely death. On his off hours, when he's not busy trying to keep the kingdom running, he's been poking around, asking questions, and trying to figure out what Jon Arryn was up to before he died. At first, he doesn't get anywhere. And in fact, his one big break is discovering that shortly before his death, Jon Arryn had borrowed a book from Maester Pycelle. When Ned gets his hands on it, he immediately discovers just how monumentally boring it is. It's a genealogy of Baratheon marriages, who married who, what they looked like, how many kids they had, what those kids looked like, etc., etc., etc. Not exactly easy summer reading. But things do start picking up. And eventually this investigation of his, it sort of becomes like an episode of Murder, She Wrote. Everywhere that Ned goes, someone says, "Well, Shoxy, you're the second hand that's come by here," which is a good sign, because it means that he's following in Jon Arryn's footsteps. And eventually that leads him to a local blacksmith and his apprentice. Evidently, before he passed away, Jon Arryn stopped by, as did, ominously, Stannis Baratheon. And as soon as Ned meets the apprentice, he's pretty sure he knows why. The kid looks exactly like a young Robert Baratheon. Huge, muscled, thick black hair everywhere. I mean, this kid is definitely of Baratheon stock. which, in and of itself, isn't too surprising. I mean, at this point, Robert sired a number of children with people other than his wife, who, unbeknownst to Robert, he hasn't sired any children with. In fact, the whole realm knows that Robert's gotten around, so now it's Ned's job to figure out why Jon Arryn would take an interest in any of his bastards. Before he can get too deep into his investigation, though, he gets word from Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, the master of coin. And Littlefinger says that he has a surprise for him. And so the two of them head over to one of Littlefinger's brothels, walk into a back room, and there's Catelyn Stark. Now, why would Catelyn be in Littlefinger's brothel? Well, it's not a career change. Instead, it goes back to that history I was telling you about. The history between Ned and Littlefinger. Although, that's honestly a little misleading on my part, because really, it's much more of a history between Catelyn and Littlefinger. See, Peter Baelish's father was a tiny lord from the Fingers, which is part of the coast up near the Vale. Nothing really happens there, there's nothing of any real value, but Peter's father served in a war with Hoster Tully and saved his life. And as thanks, Hoster Tully took Peter as a ward, which was a big deal, huge honor, all that sort of stuff. Now, Hoster Tully had 3 children, Cat, Lysa, and Edmure, and the 3 of them all became friends with Littlefinger. Close friends, and actually it was Edmure who named him, as Peter's a smaller man, he's from the Fingers, and Edmure's not exactly the most creative guy in the Riverlands. So the 4 of them had a pretty good childhood with one tiny hiccup. Peter was in love with Catelyn. He kept it to himself, though, until she got engaged to Brandon Stark, at which point he announced his true feelings to the world by challenging Brandon Stark to a duel, which is a pretty dumb move coming from a pretty smart guy. I mean, Brandon was a warrior who'd been training with a sword since he could walk, and a duel between the two of them wouldn't be a contest, it'd be like a tiny bird trying to kill a direwolf. Still, Catelyn liked Peter. He was a little less than a brother, but still much more than a friend, and so she asked Brandon to let him live, which he did. Although, Brandon still hurt him so badly that it took him weeks to recover. And once Hoster Tully got word of what happened, Peter was banished back to the Fingers, and Catelyn hasn't seen him since. But Lysa Arryn has. She was friends with Peter too, and stayed in touch with him over the years. After she moved to King's Landing, she lobbied her husband, Jon Arryn, to bring him to court, which he did. And from there, well, Littlefinger was smart enough to eventually rise from a desk clerk to a master of coin within 3 years. And he doesn't just concern himself with financial matters. He's got his little fingers in a whole bunch of little pies, as it were. Sometimes it seems like he even gives Varys a run for his money in the secret gathering department. Which is why, when Catelyn secretly arrived in King's Landing, it's not a secret to Littlefinger. Pretty quickly, he has her scooped up and shuttled over to his brothel. After all, if people were looking for a highborn lady, a house of ill repute would probably be low on their list of places to search. After a little bit of awkward, don't worry about how I knew you were coming, I'm just here to help, and no, I'm not obsessively in love with you anymore type small talk, Peter goes and gets Ned. And once Ned and Catelyn are reunited, there's not a lot of time for pleasantries. Cat fills Ned in on the assassin's attack, lays out her reasons for coming to King's Landing, and then puts Ned's detective skills to shame. Because within 5 minutes of arriving in King's Landing, she finds out who the dagger belonged to. It's Littlefinger's. Or rather, as he's pretty quick to explain, it was Littlefinger's. He lost it a year ago, betting at a tournament. He wagered that Jaime Lannister would win at the lists, but Jaime had an off day, and Littlefinger lost the dagger to none other than Tyrion Lannister, the imp. And as far as Littlefinger knows, it's been Tyrion's dagger ever since. This information takes an already tense situation and just turns it up a notch. Because now, Lysa and Peter have both implicated the Lannisters in, well, not only murder, but attempted murder as well. And deep down in his bones, Ned is certain that this is all connected to whatever it was Jon Arryn was investigating before his death. And once Ned finds that information out and presents it to Robert, well, it's anyone's guess what could happen. And I think it's important to remember, these people are all members of great families, so their actions aren't just limited to a few people. I mean, each of these families commands an army, and any major disagreement between the great lords of Westeros will be settled in battle. War is a very, very real possibility, and Ned knows that. Which is why he immediately sends Catelyn back home to Winterfell. Not only is it safer for her there, but he also needs her to quietly mobilize the North. Once again, Meister Martin has a transcript of Ned and Catelyn's conversation. This is Ned speaking now, saying, quote, Once you are home, send word to Helman Tallheart and Galbart Glover under my seal. They are to raise 100 bowmen each and fortify Moat Cailin. 200 determined archers can hold the neck against an army. Instruct Lord Manderley that he is to strengthen and repair all his defenses at White Harbor, and see that they are well manned. And from this day on, I want a careful watch kept over Theon Greyjoy. If there is war, we shall have sore need of his father's fleet. Those men Ned just mentioned are some of his bannermen, and what he's asking them to do? That's no small thing. He's fortifying the North against invaders. And then he goes on to say, quote, "The Lannisters are merciless in the face of weakness, as Aerys Targaryen learned to his sorrow, but they would not dare attack the North without all the power of the realm behind them, and that they shall not have. I must play out this fool's masquerade as if nothing is amiss. Remember why I came here, my love." End quote. Ned went to King's Landing to figure out why Jon Arryn was murdered, and if the Lannisters were behind it. And if he can do that, and get some tangible evidence, he can bring his accusations to Robert. It's almost the exact same situation he was in back in Winterfell. Only now, he's more convinced than ever that he's on the right path, and he's equally certain that the stakes are very high and very real. Because again, once he accuses the Queen, well, first off, there's no telling what Robert will do. The old Robert the lifelong friend, he would listen to anything Ned had to say. But the new Robert the King? Maybe not. But in addition to that, once Ned finds his proof and levels his accusations, he won't just be accusing the Queen. By extension, he'll be accusing her entire very rich, very powerful family. That includes her hyper-violent brother Jaime, their merciless father Tywin, and even though Ned's not particularly worried about him, it also includes Tyrion Lannister. Now, you've heard me talk about Tyrion Lannister before, but mostly in passing, as someone that people react to rather than someone who actually does things. Well, this is the part of the story where, it's the part of the story where he takes his first steps away from being someone on the periphery and he starts becoming a major player. This is when we talk about him as an important man of action rather than letting him be overshadowed by somebody else. But before we do that, we need to talk about somebody else. We need to talk briefly about Jon Snow. Now, as far as bastards go, Jon Snow is pretty lucky. Ned Stark is a decent guy and raised him like a son. He's become close friends with Robb, and he gets along with most of the other Stark kids. Life could be worse. But after Ned became Hand of the King, there were really only two options for his children. Go with him to King's Landing, or stay behind in Winterfell. And neither one of those was an option for Jon. King's Landing was out because, as progressive as Ned is, having a bastard at court would be a bad idea. It's just not an option. A new hand that nobody really knows can't just show up in the Red Keep, start bossing people around, and shove his bastard son down polite society's throat. That's not how you make a good first impression. And Jon also couldn't stay in Winterfell, even though he and Robb are his closest brothers. I mean, the two of them are best friends, but it doesn't matter. Because with Ned gone, and Robb still just a great lord in training, Catelyn Stark would be running the Winterfell show, and she hates Jon. I mean, she hates Jon. When she looks at him, she just sees a constant reminder that Ned was unfaithful. To her, he's not a kid. He's a giant walking reminder that Ned had shared his bed with another woman after they had been married, and it drives her crazy. Not only that, but there are legal reasons for her to be antagonistically wary of Jon as well. You see, bastards don't have any rights, but they can be legitimized by a king. And if that happens, the laws of inheritance get real complicated real quick. And if you want an example of those types of complications, I highly recommend reading up about House Blackfyre and the series of rebellions by which they tried to lay claim to the Iron Throne. And so, while it's extraordinarily slim, there is a real chance that having Jon around could one day interfere with the Stark children's inheritance. Specifically Robb's, who's the eldest and currently in line to become the next Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. And that's a risk that Catelyn's simply not willing to take. So Jon can't go with Ned, and he can't stay home. He doesn't have a job, or titles, or money, or anything to help him make it out in the world on his own. That's a tough situation for anyone to be in, let alone a 14-year-old bastard. So what does he do? Well, he enlists. But Jon doesn't just run off and join up with some local army. No, he joins the Night's Watch. And it's been a while since we've talked about them, but the Night's Watch, they're that group of, they're kind of like armed security guards mixed with park rangers. And it's their job to guard the wall, which is that massive, wall, I guess, but that's a few hundred miles north of Winterfell. The wall is over 700 feet tall. It's made out of some sort of magically reinforced ice, and it runs across the width of the entire continent, over 300 miles from sea to sea. So that's the barrier between the Seven Kingdoms and the land of always winter, which is sort of a no man's land. Nobody's sure who built it or why exactly. Information like that tends to get lost when something is over 8,000 years old. All anybody knows is that it was designed to keep something very, very dangerous away from the realms of men. As you might imagine, a wall that big requires a lot of upkeep, a lot of defense, and it's the Night Watch's job to provide both. And for the first few thousand years of their existence, joining the Night's Watch was, well, it wasn't only a respectable thing to do, it was actually considered to be a pretty noble calling. Their ranks were filled with thousands of volunteers, spread out across hundreds of miles of, well, what was basically a defensive glacier studded with military garrisons. If you can imagine what the Maginot Line would have looked like if you built it on the edge of an ice sheet, that's not too far off from how the Night's Watch used to run things up on the wall. But by the time Robert is crowned king, the Night's Watch is a shadow of its former self. Something like 95% of the castles that run along the wall have been abandoned, and a lot of them are in pretty advanced stages of utter disrepair, crumbling from a combination of, well, just lack of upkeep and natural wear and tear from the harsh conditions up north. And the Night's Watch themselves aren't faring much better. There are under 1,000 members, and most of them are rapists or murderers, criminals who were given the choice of going to the wall or going to jail. But there are a few notable exceptions. For example, Ned Stark's younger brother, a guy called Benjen Stark, is pretty high up in the Watch's ranks. And there are some other quality individuals as well who have somehow managed to find themselves stationed there. Which is to say, it's a rough life, but it's not a hopeless one. And that means that, well, if you're the bastard who's out of options, joining the Night's Watch isn't necessarily the worst thing that you could do. So the day that Ned heads south with Robert, Jon Snow heads north to the Wall, and Tyrion Lannister, who was in Winterfell with the royal party, goes with him. And Tyrion, this is maybe just my personal opinion, but it's hard not to like this guy. First off, he's a natural-born underdog. Literally. He's born a dwarf with a shrunken forehead and mismatched eyes. Right from the start, everybody thinks of him as, well, you know how you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover? Nobody in Westeros buys into that. They take one look at Tyrion and they call him a monster or an abomination or a demon monkey or worse. Just all sorts of terrible stuff. As it turns out, even illiterate small folk can be pretty creative when there's a highborn dwarf around. So, as you might imagine, Tyrion had a difficult childhood. Very difficult. His mother was a lovely woman, but he never got a chance to meet her because she died giving birth to him. Meanwhile, his sister hates him partly for, in her mind, killing their mother, and partly because Cersei just seems to hate pretty much everybody who isn't Cersei, Jaime, or her children. And if you could measure Tyrion hate on a scale from 1 to 10, let's say Cersei's always been at a 7 or so, whereas Tyrion's father, Tywin Lannister, he's been at 100 since day one. Tywin despises Tyrion. First off, for being a dwarf, which he considers an embarrassment to the Lannister name, and second, again in his mind, for killing the love of his life. And trust me when I tell you that Tywin Lannister is not an enemy you want in general, let alone when you're just trying to, navigate something like a childhood. In fact, growing up, the only person who ever showed him any amount of kindness was his elder brother, Jaime. But aside from him, Tyrion grew up being ridiculed, mocked, and bullied to the point of torture. More on that in a moment. But Tyrion was just constantly insulted by strangers and by his family. Saying that he's had a difficult childhood doesn't really even begin to cover what he went through. Yet despite growing up in an environment that could turn anybody into a cruel, bitter, vengeful person, Tyrion seems to be, from everything I've read about him, he seems like a genuinely good guy. And also an extremely likable one. He's a rake or a rogue even. He's a real charmer. And he's smart. Incredibly smart. In fact, earlier I mentioned that if anybody ever deserved to be called a genius, it was Tywin Lannister. Well, I'm going to open that up a bit and say that Tyrion deserves to be called one too. Which isn't to say he's perfect. Far from it. He's actually a little bit like Robert Baratheon in that his appetites are constantly getting him into trouble. For starters, he's a functioning alcoholic. He's addicted to prostitutes. He's constantly saying something when he shouldn't, and so on and so forth. So yes, he's still got some personal issues to work through. But who wouldn't if they had his upbringing? And he's joining Jon Snow because he's a curious guy. I mean, most people in the Seven Kingdoms know there's this giant magical mystery wall to the north, but they seem to just, to borrow a phrase from earlier, they have kind of a big deal attitude towards it. And granted, if you're a peasant, your travel options are limited, so it's no surprise there's not a lot of small folk headed to the wall, but you don't see many lords and ladies, and people of means, making it a popular tourist destination either. Which it blows my mind. If I were in Westeros, that's the first place I'd go. Well, maybe. I guess it depends on whether or not it was winter. But it isn't winter. Not yet, at least. And Tyrion knows that he might not be this far north again for years, if ever, and he's not going to pass up a chance to see the wall. So he tags along with Jon Snow to see what the top of the world looks like. Or, as he says, so that he can get a chance to piss off the edge of the world. Like I said, he's a bit of a rogue. And so when Tyrion leaves Winterfell, he's pretty excited. And I mention that because he doesn't come across at all like someone who just handed a Valyrian knife over to an assassin and set up the murder of a comatose child. In fact, on his journey north, all he's doing basically the entire time is winning people over. By the time he heads back south, and for those who are curious, yes, he did manage to urinate off the top of the wall, but by the time he heads back south, he's friends with Jon Snow, and he's friends with the leader of the Night's Watch, and heck, the man practically begs him to stay. And then, on his way back south, Tyrion swings by Winterfell to give Bran a custom-made design for a saddle that wouldn't require the use of his legs. You read about all this stuff, and instead of coming across like the evil monster that Littlefinger claimed he was, Tyrion comes across as a good guy who's completely clueless about any attack on Bran's life, let alone that he's been implicated as the one who orchestrated it. Because remember, at this point, the only people who know about his supposed involvement are Catelyn, Ned, Littlefinger, and just because he seems to know about pretty much everything that's supposed to be a secret, most likely Varys the Spider. If Tyrion had known, though, he probably would have kept a lower profile on his way back to King's Landing. But he doesn't. And so on one of those grand, almost unbelievable Gavrio Princip-level coincidences, Tyrion stops at an inn in the Riverlands to get a room, some rest, and probably a few drinks. And when he walks in, he sees, sitting at a table in the back of the tavern, posing as a commoner, one of the only 4 people in the entire world who suspects him of murder. It's the kind of coincidence that almost makes you believe in fate. Catelyn Stark and her entourage had arrived at the inn just before Tyrion, but she's keeping a low profile. Remember, Ned had sent her north to prepare the Stark's bannermen for a Lannister invasion, but she's traveling as a commoner to escape notice. And even though she hates Tyrion and thinks he's a monster, she manages to keep her cool enough not to blow her cover. But once Tyrion notices her, he's actually sort of happy, and basically does the equivalent of, oh wow, of all the bars in all of Westeros, who would have thought that we'd run into each other here? But Catelyn has a different reaction. She's convinced that Tyrion's family tried to murder her son twice, once with an assassin and once with a window. So when she sees Tyrion and his 2 stewards walk in, to her it's not a weird, oh, what are the chances kind of thing. It's a chance to get some justice for her son. She reveals to the entire bar that she's the Lady of Winterfell, a daughter of Hoster Tully, Lord of the Riverlands, and that if the men in this inn have any honor, they'll help her detain Tyrion because he tried to murder her son. Well, as it turns out, nobody likes a child murderer. And the next thing you know, Tyrion's got a dozen swords pointed at his neck and has gone from roguish traveler to helpless prisoner. And nobody really knew it at the time, but this was, in a lot of ways, the opening shot of the War of the Five Kings. I mean, there's been stuff that led up to this moment that, once the war plays out, you could look back at it and point to as being the first real act of aggression. But this is the first open and overt hostility between houses. And even though nobody's arguing about who the real king is yet, this is the first moment when... What's the first moment when all of the behind-the-scenes plotting and suspicion is able to break through the layers of political decorum and come out in the open? And that is a very, very big deal. Because... well, Well, one of the things that Tyrion has had to deal with his entire life is that, in a lot of ways, his last name is more powerful than he is. It's almost a separate entity. And what I mean by that is, Tywin Lannister probably wouldn't care if Catelyn Stark arrested Tyrion. Heck, he wouldn't mind if she tied him up, threw him in a catapult, and launched him off into space. He'd probably pay her to do it. But she didn't arrest Tyrion. She arrested Tyrion Lannister. And that means that House Stark just made a formal accusation against House Lannister in a room full of people. And when Tywin Lannister hears about that, well, he's going to do the same thing he always does when the Lannister name is at stake. I mean, first he's probably going to tell every bard in the realm to brush up on the reigns of Castamere, but then he's going to bypass talking things out and go straight to handing out a giant helping of extreme vengeance. Catelyn knows that when word gets out about what she's done, people will come looking for her party. And she knows that she probably can't make it to River Run before that happens, and there's also no way that she can head back to King's Landing with the Queen's brother as a hostage. So she does something unexpected. She tells the entire inn that she's headed north to Winterfell, and then immediately heads east to the Vale, which is just a short journey east from the inn where she captured Tyrion. That's where her sister Lysa Arryn is, that's where her sister's armies are, and that's where she'll be able to breathe for a moment and figure out what her next move is. And although it's the best option, getting there isn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. Catelyn and her party spend most of the trip fighting off lawless clans of mountain folk and lose a significant chunk of the people they set out with. It gets so bad that Catelyn actually unchains Tyrion and gives him a weapon so that he can help fight. It was a harrowing trip, and it's easy to imagine the sense of relief Catelyn must have felt when she and her party finally arrived at the Eyrie. Unfortunately for her, it's a relief that's short-lived, because it turns out that Catelyn's next move is trying to figure out how to deal with her sister. They haven't seen each other in years, and Lysa is not the same person that Cat remembers. I don't know if you've ever heard of borderline personality disorder. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, just a fan of psychology. But the list of symptoms seems to fit Lysa Arryn pretty well. She's subject to wild mood swings, obsesses over imagined insults, is paranoid to a fault. She's extremely narcissistic, and she doesn't really seem to care about anyone other than herself and her 6-year-old son. And the first thing she does when Cat arrives is yell at her. She's furious that Cat would bring a Lannister to the Eyrie. But then she follows that up by accusing Tyrion of murdering Jon Arryn. And when Catelyn says, whoa, pump the brakes, your secret letter accused Cersei Lannister of that, not Tyrion, Lysa replies with, well, Lannisters are all the same, so what difference does it make? Which, to me at least, comes across as someone who's making accusations up on the fly. And if you're Catelyn Stark, well, that has to give you pause, doesn't it? It was Lysa's accusation that Jon was murdered that made Ned decide to go south to King's Landing in the first place. But maybe Jon Arryn wasn't murdered. Maybe Lysa is just completely paranoid and insane. Maybe all of this has been for nothing. But it's far, far too late to second-guess that now, because whether or not Lysa is stark raving mad, Catelyn's brought a Lannister into her home as a prisoner, and so at this point, things are moving ahead regardless of whether or not they should be. Now, there are limits to Tyrion's decency. And since he's been kidnapped, dragged across the mountains, attacked by bandits, and now accused of murdering Jon Arryn and trying to murder Bran Stark, well, he loses his cool a bit, yells at everyone, and refuses to confess, justifiably, and is thrown in a dungeon for his efforts. Which, just a quick sidebar here, the Eyrie has the greatest dungeons. And I know you're not supposed to say that any kind of a dungeon is great, but in this case, these things are just incredibly impressive. Like most dungeons, they're in the basement of the castle, but since the Eyrie's on top of a mountain, its basement is still higher than any tower ever built. The dungeons are called sky cells, and they're each missing a wall on one side, which leads to a several 1,000-foot drop. Prisoners are allowed to leave whenever they like, and to encourage them, the floors of the sky cells are built on a slight incline. And so Tyrion Lannister is spending his nights shivering in the cold mountain air, trying not to roll over in his sleep and fall to his death. And while he's doing that, the news that Tyrion's been kidnapped spreads throughout the Seven Kingdoms like wildfire. And again, nobody really cares that Tyrion's been kidnapped. They only care that a son of Tywin Lannister's been kidnapped. The first person to hear the news is Ned. He gets a secret message sent down to King's Landing from someone in Catelyn's party. And while Ned's not the most politically savvy guy in Westeros, he's certainly smart enough to know that this is bad news. And in a Murphy's Law kind of way, he gets this information when he's already having a terrible week. First off, his investigation into Jon Arryn's death has stalled. The case has gone cold. No new clues, which means no hard evidence, which means he's just stuck believing the Lannisters are murderers and being unable to do anything about it. And second, things aren't going well at work either. In fact, it's worse than that. Ned just got fired as Hand of the King. Well, fired or forced to resign, it depends on your point of view, but either way, he and Robert aren't on great terms at the moment. Earlier that afternoon, Ned had walked into a meeting of the small council and come face to face with a surprise guest. The king. Remember, Robert wasn't in the habit of attending small council meetings, so the fact that he's there is a pretty big deal. It means something important is up. And there is. Not in a, I'm here to help run my kingdom kind of way, but more in a, I'm here to get some people killed kind of way. Word has come from spies in Essos that Daenerys Targaryen, Mad King Aerys' daughter, has become pregnant with Khal Drogo's child. And this information drives Robert insane. Because to him, this is proof that everything he warned Ned about on their trip back from Winterfell is starting to come true. Now that Daenerys is pregnant, it's only a matter of time until she gives birth to a son, and that son will eventually get his father's army of horse-lord savages together, figure out a way to get them across the Narrow Sea, and then unleash them on the Seven Kingdoms. And as far as Robert's concerned, this isn't something that might happen, it's something that's going to happen. This unborn child might as well be Aegon the Conqueror Part 2, so unless Robert does something about it, and soon, Westeros is as good as gone. So Robert tells the small council that he wants them all killed. Viserys, Daenerys, her unborn child, all of them. And Ned basically has the worst version of deja vu possible. The only other time that he and Robert had a falling out was when Robert sanctioned the murder of Rhaegar's children. That almost destroyed their friendship. It came this close, and now it's happening all over again. Only this time, it's almost worse. Because now, instead of just showing up late and passively approving somebody else's decision to murder children, Robert's the one giving the orders. This must have been the weekly office meeting from hell. And incredibly, Meister Martin has a transcript of it, which, again, kudos to Meister Martin as his sources are just unbelievable. I mean, to me, the fact that he has actual transcripts of a closed meeting of the small council puts him on the same level as a modern-day Varys or someone like that. So, this transcript picks up when Renly, Robert Baratheon's youngest brother, is giving his thoughts on what to do about the Daenerys situation. Quote, Lord Renly shrugged. The matter seems simple enough to me. We ought to have had Viserys and his sister killed years ago, but his grace my brother made the mistake of listening to Jon Arryn. Mercy is never a mistake, Lord Renly, Ned replied. On the Trident, Sir Barristan here cut down 12 good men, Robert's friends and mine. When they brought him to us, grievously wounded and near death, Roose Bolton, who is a powerful lord in the north and bannerman to the Starks, urged us to cut his throat. But your brother said, I will not kill a man for loyalty, nor for fighting well, and sent his own Maester to tend Sir Barristan's wounds. Would that man were here today. It was not the same, he, that's Robert now speaking, complained. Sir Barristan was a knight of the King's Guard. To which Ned replies, whereas Daenerys is a 14-year-old girl. Robert, I ask you, what did we rise against Aerys Targaryen for, if not to put an end to the murder of children? To put an end to Targaryens, the king growled. End quote. Which I'm sure isn't what Ned wanted to hear. Because, at least for him, I don't think that's true at all. And to hear his friend say, well, yes, we started a war together, but we had different reasons for doing so, and mine were pretty vague and petty. Well, that's gotta sting a bit. A little bit later, it's, oddly, Grand Maester Pycelle who sort of articulates a better opposition to Ned's argument than Robert's, amorphous hatred. Pycelle says, quote, my order serves the realm, not the ruler. Once I counseled King Aerys as loyally as I counsel King Robert now, so I bear this girl child of his no ill will. Yet I ask you this, should war come again, how many soldiers will die? How many towns will burn? How many children will be ripped from their mothers to perish on the end of a spear? Is it not wiser, even kinder, that Daenerys Targaryen should die now, so that tens of thousands might live? End quote. Personally, I side with Ned. Say what you will about the Targaryens that have come before, but this Targaryen hasn't even been born yet. All this talk about preventing war is well and good, but, let's just cross that bridge when and if we ever come to it. But that having been said, I can understand where Pycelle and even Robert are coming from. I disagree with them, but I get their argument. I mean, if you could go back in time and kill Hitler's mother while he was in the womb, and you knew that by doing so you could prevent World War II, well, gosh, at the very least, you'd give it some serious thought, wouldn't you? If by killing one person, even if that person is a child, you could save thousands, maybe even millions of lives, doesn't that outweigh the impropriety of harming someone who's not even born yet? Again, I'm not saying that I agree with it, but there is a certain cold kind of logic at work in the argument here, even if it is based on the questionable assumption that all these hypothetical deaths are in fact inevitable. In the end, the matter is put to a vote. Ned and Barristan Selmy are the only two dissenters. Robert's side wins, and an assassin is sent to deal with Daenerys and her unborn child. And this decision, in what must have seemed like terrible déjà vu for Robert, a lot of that déjà vu stuff going around whenever murdering children comes up, I guess, but, this decision drives Ned insane. He wouldn't have anything to do with the murder of children 15 years earlier, and he won't have anything to do with it now, even if that means that his friendship with Robert is at an end. And so Ned resigns as Hand of the King, right there in the middle of the small council meeting. And Robert flips out. He basically says, "You're gonna resign? That's borderline treason, buddy. So guess what? You're banished. Get yourself back up north and don't ever let me see you again." Ned doesn't need to be told twice. On one level, his entire time in King's Landing has been sort of, basically a daily realization that Robert the war buddy is long gone, and only Robert the out-of-touch king remains. And while the former would never do anything to harm Ned even after they fought, he's not entirely sure about the latter. Ned's plan is to leave ASAP. He's already having people prepare his household for the trip back north, when Littlefinger pays him a visit. Littlefinger's found another child that Jon Arryn visited right before his death. She lives in a brothel, surprise, surprise, and if Ned's not too busy with his other plans, why, he'd be happy to take him there. And even though he knows that he needs to get out of there, Ned can't resist investigating this just a little bit further. If there's a chance that he can figure out who killed Jon Arryn, he's got to take it. I mean, that's the real reason he came to King's Landing in the first place. So he and Littlefinger travel to a brothel, and lo and behold, there's another bastard of Robert's, and her mother, a 15-year-old prostitute, who's got no idea why all these powerful people keep checking in on her and her black-haired baby girl. But other than the ickiness of the situation, there's nothing particularly unusual about the child. Same deal with the blacksmith's apprentice. Aside from being living testaments to Robert's moral center, Ned can't figure out what's so interesting about them that Jon Arryn would feel inclined to pay them both a visit. Ned's headed back to the Red Keep trying to, Nancy drew those connections together when he's stopped in the road by none other than Jaime Lannister and his guards. Jaime's gotten word that Catelyn kidnapped Tyrion, and he's livid, because Jaime might be the only guy in the entire Seven Kingdoms who actually cares about Tyrion. They've always been close, and it seems to me that, as an adult, Jaime's affection for his younger brother is almost like a lifeline to the person he used to be. The person who probably wouldn't throw 8-year-olds out of tower windows. But even if that wasn't the case, and even if he hated Tyrion like everyone else, he'd still be ticked off by what Catelyn did, because the honor of House Lannister has been insulted in a major way. Tyrion has a great description of Jaime's problem-solving abilities, saying that he would never untie a knot when he could just slash it in two with his sword. And that's exactly what he's doing now. Jaime can't kill Ned. He's a great lord, after all. But he can sure as heck, as he thinks of it, teach him a lesson. Ned was traveling with some of his men, and Jaime has them slaughtered, right there in the street. And Ned, good guy that he is, tries to intervene. Which, in heartbreakingly typical Ned Stark fashion, is noble but useless. There are way more Lannister guards than Starks, and so all that happens is Ned gets knocked off his horse, shatters his leg in the fall, and has to watch his men get butchered in the streets as he slowly loses consciousness. This is what happens when powerful lords fight. And it's a good example of why, when Lysa first accused the Queen of murder, for instance, why Ned didn't immediately go and tell Robert about it. Because when the honor of great houses is called into question, things can go really bad, really fast. Which is why as soon as Catelyn kidnapped Tyrion, she started a chain reaction of violence and revenge. It started with a kidnapping, now it's moved to an attack, and if something's not done to contain it, that attack is going to lead to a fight between the Starks and Lannisters, and if that happens, well, a full-blown war can't be too far behind. When Ned wakes up, he's back at the Red Keep. Robert's there by his bedside. And Robert is someone who really, really could have benefited from a little therapy. Or at least some anger management. When he fired Ned, he was like a bull that could only see red. But now that a few hours have gone past and he's cooled off, he feels bad about the whole thing, and he wants Ned to be the Hand again. It's an offer that Ned, who's had a crazy evening and is a little hopped up on milk of the poppy, painkillers, but Ned is too woozy to deny. And he also wants Ned to patch things up with Jaime. He's not concerned about the specifics of who did what to who first. This is a problem that Robert would rather not deal with, and so he's basically ordering that it all just go away. But the problem won't go away, so Robert does instead. He informs Ned that he's going on a hunting trip, and by the time he gets back, he wants all this silly drama between Starks and Lannisters to be patched up, water under the bridge. And this is, Robert leaving to hunt, it's a bonehead move of Mace Tyrellian proportions. Robert's always been an absentee king, but normally it's just because he's trying to avoid the day-to-day drudgery of counting coppers and listening to petitioners and that sort of thing. But what's going on now is anything but the normal day-to-day business of the kingdom. It's the rattling of sabers heralding the arrival of full-blown war. Members of great houses are kidnapping each other or attacking one another in the streets, tensions are very high, and Robert's going on a hunting trip? This is the worst time to take a vacation. This is like FDR hearing about Pearl Harbor and deciding it was time to go golfing for a month and saying that when he gets back, he'd really like it if this whole World War thing was cleaned up for him. And while he's gone, Robert, that is, not FDR, the situation does not get any better. In fact, everything just gets worse. For starters, after openly attacking Ned's party in the streets of King's Landing, Jaime Lannister flees back to Casterly Rock and starts assembling an army near the Westerlands border with the Riverlands. The Riverlands are ruled by Hoster Tully, Catelyn's father, but he's been sick recently. Extremely sick. Too sick to govern. And so his son, Edmure Tully, has been ruling in his stead. And when he sees this army forming on his border, Edmure starts sending messages over saying, "What the heck are you guys doing over there?" But he doesn't get any response. Because really, it's obvious what the Lannisters are doing. To the Lannisters, it doesn't matter that the Tullys didn't have anything to do with Tyrion's kidnapping. They're guilty by association, and they're going to pay. And what's almost worse news for the Tullys and for the realm is that Jaime wouldn't do something like this unless he had his father's express permission. Which means that Tywin Lannister has gotten involved, and that means that the country just took another huge step towards war. But actually, the war's already started. With Robert gone, Ned's the one who has to act as king, and a big part of that job is hearing complaints from the common folk and deciding what to do about them. On day one, a group of villagers is brought before the Iron Throne. They're from towns in the Riverlands that are close to the borders with the Westerlands. Or they were. Their towns have been attacked, brutally destroyed by knights, and basically obliterated. And the knights who obliterated them, they're not just any knights. They're well-funded knights. Knights with the best war horses, the best armor, and the best weapons. Knights who weren't wearing any heraldry or carrying any banners or anything that might give away who they're loyal to. So there's no way to tell who they're working for. There's no clues about who sent them. Except for one. According to the townsfolk, the leader of this well-funded raiding party was so big that he almost wasn't a man. He was more like a giant, or a mountain even. A mountain that rides. And the only person in the entire kingdom that matches that description is Gregor Clegane. He's one of Lord Tywin's bannermen, and he was also one of the two knights who during the sack of King's Landing was sent to take care of Rhaegar's children. He's the guy who I believe is pure evil. And from what the townfolk are saying, the things he did to their villages, well, it sounds like he hasn't changed a bit. This actually reminds me a little bit of what's going on right now in the Crimean. The soldiers who are attacking the Chechens, but not wearing anything that would mark them as Russians, even though just about everybody knows that's who they are, same thing here. This is Tywin Lannister sort of testing the waters of war, in a way that allows him to say, oh, those bannerless knights? Nope, not mine, even though everyone knows that's not the truth. This is as openly hostile as the Lannisters can be without flat-out declaring war, and this is just Tywin probing around Westeros to see what the battlefield will look like when the main event begins. Some of these men from the Riverlands tell Ned that Edmure Tully has sent men to all of his outlying villages so that if there is another attack by this nameless raiding party, well, his people won't be left defenseless. Which, if Tywin is the one funding Clegane's river raiders, well, that's exactly what he'd want Edmure to do. If the Lannisters do attack, the Tullys won't be able to respond with all their power, since they'll be spread so thin trying to protect everyone from Gregor Clegane. But Edmure's he's a guy who acts before thinking. He can't see what Tywin's up to. And even if Tywin wasn't funding Clegane's river raiders, which he absolutely was, but even if Tywin wasn't involved, all of the villagers are sure that Gregor Clegane's the one leading it. And so Ned orders a lordling from the south, Beric Dondarrion, to get a couple of hundred knights together, chase down Clegane, and execute him in the name of the king. This is a tacit way of Ned accusing Tywin. Again, everybody's being pretty careful not to make any moves that can be interpreted as open hostility, so this is as much of an attack as Ned can launch against the Lannisters without directly attacking the Lannisters themselves. And once Ned gives the order, people start slipping out of the hall. They've got to go and make preparations. They've got to warn their families. Because monster or not, Gregor Clegane is a pretty powerful bannerman to an insanely powerful Great Lord. Which means that now, war is almost an inevitability. This is like those 12 days in November during the Kennedy administration, or August of 1914. The country is teetering on the edge of Armageddon. The slightest thing could set it off. If ever there was a time when the realm needed a strong king, it's now. Which is too bad. Because the realm doesn't have a strong king. It has a monarch who's off hunting in the woods, who's sticking his head in the sand and hoping that by the time he gets back, the whole thing will have blown over so that he won't have to deal with it anymore. And, in a sort of tragically funny kind of way, he's going to get that wish. Because King Robert Baratheon is about to die. Next time on Shadow of the Dragon.